On August 14, 2024, a specialized logging crew in the Umpqua National Forest found a single size 7 hiking boot lodged 30 feet up inside the rotted, hollowed-out core of a 200-year-old Douglas fir. When they looked down into the darkness of the trunk, they didn't see a body. They saw two pairs of eyes reflecting their headlamps. The brothers were standing on a bed of their own hair, which they had spent 62 days systematically cutting off and weaving into the interior bark of the tree. They weren't shouting for help. They were whispering a sequence of numbers that didn't correspond to any date, any coordinate, or any known code. Why did two experienced outdoorsmen spend 2 months inside a vertical wooden tomb? To understand the answer, you have to look at July 12, 2024. Elias and Julian Thorne were not amateurs. Elias was a 34-year-old structural engineer. Julian was 29 and a certified wilderness first responder. They had climbed the Cascades. They had kayaked the Rogue River. They were the people you called when someone else got lost. On that Friday morning, they checked into the Tokatee Falls trailhead. They signed the registry at 8:14 a.m. They had 3 days of supplies, a satellite messenger, and a topographic map. They were heading for a specific ridge, an area they had hiked a dozen times before. The weather was a consistent 72 degrees. There was no storm. There was no technical terrain on their planned route. They were walking into a landscape they owned. But at 4:47 p.m. that same afternoon, Elias's phone pinged a tower 40 miles to the east, in an area where there are no roads and no trails. That was the last transmission. The search began 3 days later when they failed to return. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office deployed 45 people, 3 K-9 units, and 2 heat-sensing drones. They found nothing. No scrap of fabric, no disturbed brush, no scent for the dogs. It was as if the brothers had simply been erased from the topographical map. But here is what the search party didn't release until late 2025. On the 4th day of the search, a volunteer found Julian's Garmin GPS device sitting perfectly level on a flat stump exactly 2.2 miles from their car. The device was turned on. The battery was at 92%. When analysts extracted the data, they found the device had recorded a straight, unbroken line of travel for 6 miles, moving at a constant speed of 11 miles per hour. That is a dead sprint. No human being can maintain an 11-mile-per-hour sprint through dense, off-trail Oregon brush for 6 miles without stopping, without deviating, and without falling. This detail wasn't released because it didn't make sense. It suggested the brothers weren't walking, they were being moved. Imagine you are Elias. You are the older brother. You are the one who knows how structures hold weight. You are standing in a forest you've known since childhood. You check your compass and the needle isn't pointing north. It isn't spinning either. It's pointing at your brother. Every time Julian moves, the needle follows him. You think it's a joke. You think it's a magnetic interference from a buried pipe. Then you realize your watch has stopped. You check Julian's watch. It stopped at the exact same second, 4:47 p.m. You aren't lost yet. You are just experiencing a series of technical failures. You decide to head back to the car. You follow the creek because the creek always leads to the road. But after 3 hours of hiking downstream, the water starts flowing uphill. You stop. You look at the water. You pour some from your canteen onto the ground to verify gravity. The water from your canteen pools at your feet, but the creek next to you continues to move toward the mountain peaks. This is where the first wrong turn happened. They didn't panic. They did what the manual says. They stayed put. They built a fire. But the fire they built didn't produce heat. The logs charred. The flames turned a dull matte orange. But Elias later told investigators he could put his hand directly into the center of the embers and feel nothing but a mild oscillating vibration. At 3:12 a.m. on July 13th, the brothers heard the first sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a structural engineer's office, the specific rhythmic clicking of a plotter printer and the hum of a server rack. In the middle of the Umpqua National Forest, 30 miles from the nearest power line, the woods were projecting the sounds of Elias's workplace. Julian wanted to run. Elias, the rational one, the man of math and physics, insisted they wait for daylight. He sat there, his back against a Douglas fir, watching a fire that couldn't burn him, listening to a forest that was reciting his own life back to him. When the sun finally rose, it didn't come from the east. The light simply faded in, omnidirectional and gray, casting no shadows. They checked the GPS. This is when they found the device sitting on the stump. Julian didn't place it there. Elias didn't place it there. They found it already waiting for them, showing a path they hadn't taken. They followed the creek again, desperate now, but the creek was gone. In its place was a dry white trench filled with the bones of small birds, thousands of them, all positioned with their beaks pointing toward a single tree, a tree that wasn't there the night before. You've probably hiked a trail like this. You've felt that moment where the woods go quiet, the quiet zone investigators call an acoustic shadow. Usually it's just topography. But for the Thorne brothers, the silence didn't just muffle sound, it replaced it. Julian began to complain of a pressure behind his eyes. He said the trees weren't trees anymore. He described them as columns holding up a ceiling we aren't supposed to see. He started peeling the bark off a Douglas fir with his fingernails. Underneath the bark, he didn't find wood. He found a surface that was smooth, black, and reflected his own face with terrifying clarity. He saw himself, but he was 60 days older. He saw himself with a beard he hadn't grown yet, and eyes that had seen something he hadn't experienced. This wasn't a hallucination brought on by dehydration. They had plenty of water. They had food. They were only 6 miles from the trailhead. But the geography had become impossible. At 11 a.m. on July 14th, Elias realized they were walking in a circle, but the circle was shrinking. Every time they passed a specific rock formation, it was 10 feet closer to them than the last time. The forest was tightening. The space between the trunks was narrowing. They weren't being hunted by a predator. They were being squeezed by the environment itself. Julian found the hollow tree. It was a massive, ancient Douglas fir, its interior rotted out by a fungus the Forest Service later couldn't identify. He climbed inside. He told Elias it was the only place where the whispering stopped. Elias followed him. They climbed up the interior ridges of the rotted wood 30 feet into the air, and they stayed there. They stayed there while the search teams passed 10 feet away. They stayed there while the K-9s circled the base of the tree and barked at nothing. They stayed there while their own names were shouted through megaphones. They didn't answer. Ask yourself why 2 grown men, one a medical professional, would hide from their rescuers. The lead investigator later admitted that the dogs didn't lose the scent. The dogs refused to cross a specific perimeter around that tree. They would sit down, whine, and claw at their own ears until their paws bled. No one has explained this. No one has tried. When the brothers were finally pulled from the tree on September 14, 2024, the medical staff at Mercy Medical Center expected to treat advanced emaciation, scurvy, and muscle atrophy. Instead, they found something that defied clinical logic. Despite being missing for 62 days, Elias and Julian Thorne had gained weight, not fat, lean muscle mass. Their vitals were not those of starving men. Their resting heart rates were a synchronized 48 beats per minute, and their body temperatures were a constant 95.2 degrees. In the medical world, this is known as stable hypothermia, a state that should result in cognitive collapse and organ failure within hours. They had lived in it for 2 months, but here's what the police didn't release until 2025. The hair found woven into the tree bark wasn't just human, it was fused. Forensic analysts discovered that the brothers' hair had biologically grafted into the cellulose of the Douglas fir. They weren't just hiding inside the tree, they were becoming a structural component of it. The investigation into the Hollow Two, as the local deputies called them, took a darker turn when the sheriff's department processed the items found at the bottom of that hollow trunk. Among the discarded candy wrappers and empty water pouches was a notebook belonging to Elias. The first 40 pages were standard engineering calculations. The 41st page, dated July 19th, contained a single sentence repeated 400 times. The depth is not downward. Below that, a hand-drawn map of the Umpqua National Forest showed a topography that doesn't exist. It depicted the mountains as voids and the valleys as solid, impenetrable peaks. At the 2-minute mark of the recovery, as the brothers were being lowered by harness, a deputy noticed Julian's hands. His fingernails were gone. In their place were hardened, jagged shards of what appeared to be obsidian. When a paramedic tried to clean the dirt from Julian's cuticles, the substance sliced through a pair of heavy-duty nitrile gloves. It wasn't stone. Lab results later identified the material as a high-density carbon polymer that had replaced the keratin in his nail beds. This detail was buried in the supplemental report. Ask yourself why a state crime lab would classify the chemical composition of a missing person's fingernails. The search team leader, Marcus Thorne, no relation, later admitted in a leaked deposition that the tree itself was a physical impossibility. "We measured the exterior diameter at 6 feet, he stated, but when we sent a technician inside with a laser rangefinder, the internal volume recorded a width of 14 feet. It was wider on the inside than it was on the outside. This is what investigators call a spatial non-congruence. It suggests that for 62 days, the Thorne brothers weren't just in the woods, they were in a pocket of reality that had folded in on itself. None of this explains what was found in Julian's pocket. He was wearing the same cargo shorts he disappeared in, but inside the zippered side pocket was a Polaroid photograph. The film stock was discontinued in 1994. The photo showed Elias and Julian standing in front of the very tree they were found in, but they were children, roughly 8 and 10 years old. In the background of the photo, a figure is visible in the tree line. It is a man wearing a modern 2024 issue search and rescue vest. The name tag on the vest, clearly visible under a microscope, reads M. Thorne. The brothers didn't just walk into a mystery, they walked into a closed loop. At 12 p.m. on the day of their rescue, the lead investigator tried to interview Elias. He asked, "How did you survive without a water source?" Elias didn't look at him. He looked at the window and whispered, "We didn't need water. We just had to keep the count." When asked what count, Elias began reciting the same numbers they were whispering in the tree, 7, 19, 44, 102. These aren't coordinates. They are the exact frequencies, in hertz, of the resonant vibrations found in Douglas fir wood during a lightning strike. But here is the evidence that changes everything. The GPS device found on the stump, the one that showed them sprinting at 11 miles per hour. When the state police checked the serial number against Elias's purchase records, they found a discrepancy. Elias had bought his Garmin in 2022. The device found on the stump, identical in every way, had a manufacturing date of October 2027. We are currently in 2026. The device that led rescuers to the brothers hasn't been built yet. You're sitting in your car, or maybe your living room. You feel safe because you understand the rules of linear time. You believe that an object cannot exist before it is made. But for the Thorne brothers, the system, the forest, the time, the very air, had stopped following the rules. This isn't a theory. It's a matter of evidence sitting in a cardboard box in an evidence locker in Roseburg, Oregon. Evidence the public is told doesn't exist because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that our geography is thin. And this is where it stops making sense. If the brothers were rescued, why is there a second set of death certificates? In November 2025, a clerk in the county records office found 2 filings for Elias and Julian Thorne, dated July 14, 2024. The second day they were missing. The cause of death was listed as desiccation/exposure. These certificates were signed by a coroner who had retired 3 years prior. The system wasn't just incompetent, it was reacting to a reality where the brothers had already died, even as they were still standing inside that tree, weaving their hair into the wood. The medical records from the 3rd week of the brothers' recovery contain a term you won't find in any textbook: biological desynchronization. While Elias and Julian were physically present in room 302 of Mercy Medical, their shadows began to move 3 seconds behind their bodies. Nurses reported that when Julian reached for a glass of water, his reflection in the window wouldn't move until he had already finished drinking. This isn't a trick of the light. This is what happens when a human being is pulled out of a nonlinear environment and forced back into a three-dimensional one. At 2:14 a.m. on September 28th, the hospital's internal security feed recorded something that caused the head of security to resign the following morning. The footage shows Elias Thorne sitting up in bed. He isn't looking at the door, he is looking at the wall. In the video, the solid drywall begins to ripple like the surface of a pond. Elias reaches out, and his arm, up to the elbow, simply vanishes into the plaster. He isn't pushing through it, the wall is absorbing him. He pulls his arm back out, and held in his hand is a fresh green Douglas fir needle. The hospital is a sterile environment. There were no trees within 300 yards of that wing. This leads to the theory no one wants to believe, proposed by Dr. Elias Thorne, no relation, a biologist stripped of his credentials in 2022 for his papers on vegetative intelligence. He calls it the tree lung hypothesis. He argues that the ancient Douglas firs of the Pacific Northwest are not individual plants but terminal nodes of a single subterranean organism that operates on a different temporal frequency than humans. According to Dr. Aris, the brothers weren't stuck in a tree. They were being digested, not for their calories, but for their data. The tree was sampling their lives, weaving their hair into its bark to map their nervous systems. But here is the contradiction that reframes the entire disappearance. The brothers' mother, Sarah Thorne, received a phone call on July 15, 2024, the day the search began. The caller ID was Elias's satellite phone. The call lasted 14 minutes. When the FBI subpoenaed the records, they found that during those 14 minutes, Elias's phone was sitting in a plastic bag in the sheriff's evidence locker, powered off with the battery removed. The audio of that call, leaked by a whistleblower in 2025, consists of Elias and Julian having a conversation with themselves. Not each other, themselves. Elias is heard talking to an older version of Elias about the structural integrity of the sky. Transcript extract, July 15, 2024. Elias 1. It's not wood, it's just very dense light. Elias 2. Don't tell them about the count. If they know the numbers, they'll try to come here. Elias 1. Is it cold? Elias 2. It's exactly 95.2 degrees, forever. At 8 p.m. on October 2nd, the second disappearance occurred. Julian Thorne was scheduled for a skin graft to remove the obsidian-like growths on his hands. When the surgical team entered the room, the bed was empty. The window was locked from the inside. The door was guarded by a deputy who swore no one had passed. The only thing left in the room was Julian's hospital gown, neatly folded on the pillow. Inside the gown was 3 pounds of damp, rotted wood mulch. The police didn't release the scent dog reports from that night. The K-9 units didn't track Julian to the parking lot or the street. They tracked him to the sink. The dog sat in front of the drain and began to howl. Julian hadn't left the hospital. He had been reclaimed. The system, the police, the hospital, the government, categorized it as an escape. They put out an APB, they checked bus stations, but they didn't check the pipes. You're probably wondering about Elias. He's still here, if you can call it that. He is currently held in a private facility in Eastern Oregon. He doesn't speak anymore, except for one thing. Every day at 4:47 p.m., he stands in the center of his room and begins to vibrate. Not a seizure, a high-frequency oscillation that causes the glass in his room to shatter. He is waiting for the frequency to match. He is waiting for the count to hit 102, and this is where the investigation hits a wall. In December 2025, a drone survey of the Umpqua National Forest found that the tree the brothers were discovered in has moved. It is no longer 2.2 miles from the trailhead. It is now 4.7 miles away. Trees don't walk, but this one is migrating toward the facility where Elias is being kept. The numbers Elias and Julian Thorne were whispering, 7, 19, 44, 102, are not a code. They are a countdown. In January 2026, a specialized acoustics team from the University of Oregon secretly placed sensors around the Umpqua National Forest. They discovered that the entire forest floor is vibrating at 7 Hz. It is the frequency of the human brain's theta waves, the state between wakefulness and sleep. When that frequency climbs to 102, the tree lung doesn't just sample data, it resets the geography. But Elias wasn't lost. Elias was hidden. This is the detail the Department of the Interior suppressed. When the brothers were found, they weren't alone in that tree. Tucked into the hollow ridges above their heads were 13 other sets of hiking boots, ranging from the 1950s to the present day. Some were leather and cracked, others were modern synthetic Gore-Tex. Each pair was filled with the same dense, rotted mulch that replaced Julian in the hospital. The brothers didn't survive an ordeal. They were the first ones the forest allowed to come back and tell us what's coming. The investigator Proxy, the retired detective who leaked the 2027 dated GPS records, has since vanished. His last email was sent from a library in Roseburg. It contained no text, only a GPS coordinate that points to the exact center of a suburban cul-de-sac in Portland. People live there. Children play on that asphalt. But under the infrared spectrum, that coordinate shows a thermal void, a 95.2 degrees signature in the shape of a massive ancient root system. You've probably driven past a place like this, a patch of woods that feels wrong, a tree that seems out of place in your neighborhood. You've felt that sudden drop in temperature, that quiet zone where the birds stop singing. You think you're just tired. You think it's the wind. But remember the count. Remember that your body is 70% water, and water follows the frequency of the ground it sits on. The Thorne brothers were experienced, prepared, and competent. They did everything right, and the environment still rewrote their biology. Julian is gone, likely recycled into the water table or the marrow of a fir tree. Elias is a human tuning fork, vibrating toward a date that hasn't happened yet. If they couldn't survive the shift, what chance do you have when the frequency in your own backyard hits 102? The system wants you to believe this was a fluke of wilderness hysteria. They want you to ignore the fact that the Umpqua National Forest has grown by 400 acres this year despite record-breaking droughts. The trees aren't growing, they are arriving. The facility holding Elias is located at the corner of Mason and 5th in a 6-level concrete structure. If you walk past it at 4:47 p.m., you won't hear him screaming. You'll hear a low, rhythmic thrumming that makes your teeth ache. You'll feel a sudden, urgent need to go for a hike. The garage still operates. Cars park on that level every day. No one looks at Space 4C, but if you stand there long enough, you'll notice the oil stains on the concrete aren't shaped like spills. They look like rings. They look like a map. And the temperature is always exactly 95.2 degrees. Stay out of the quiet zones. If the creek starts flowing uphill, don't stay put. And if you find a tree that looks wider on the inside than the outside, don't look up. Because they are still in there, and they are still whispering.